basis points of capital for the loans that they were insuring. That's half of 1%, barely half of 1%. So in that case, you're talking about leverage of 180 to 1. And that went on for years before the inevitable happened and it all blew up.
How do we fix this problem of a Federal Reserve that is out of control? Meaning, if we don't shut them down, if we keep the Federal Reserve going, how do we fix this problem of them being so out of control? What would be your proposal for a remedy on that, Congressman Grayson?
The remedy begins with the audit. Okay. And then when we see what we've got, at that point we'll know what we can do. But I think that what we're going to end up doing is dramatically improving oversight and also participation by the public in what's going on. What we need to do is to have more democratic involvement, and I mean democracy, and actually I mean Democrats versus Republicans, but more democratic oversight of what's going on when we're talking about things other than the money supply itself. The areas that the Federal Reserve are getting into now, areas like foreign currency swaps, there's no reason why an organization like the Federal Reserve, which is basically completely unresponsive to the people of the United States and operates in secret, should be the ones doing this versus the Treasury Department or some other organization that actually has to answer to the people. That's where I think we're going to see this heading. We're going to see organizational changes that make the Federal Reserve smaller, that limit the Federal Reserve's authority to basic monetary policy, and also to make it more responsive to the people. Right now, Wall Street has taken over the Federal Reserve. It is literally true that the people who are making decisions in the Federal Reserve are basically people who are all Wall Street people. The banks have owned and controlled, literally owned in many cases, and certainly controlled the Federal Reserve Bank for years. They actually have seats on their board and on their committees that are set aside for people appointed by the big banks on Wall Street. And this is an organization that supposedly is responsible for determining our money supply and does determine our money supply, but does so on the basis of what's good for Wall Street and not what's good for Main Street.
That's an important point you just made, Congressman Grayson, and it reminds me, Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, stated recently that we need to remove these banking interests from the political process and talked about the amount of political contributions they make and said we almost have to surgically remove these people, but that they don't want surgery and that it would be better for the wider civilization to have them removed. That's my next question for you then. How do we square that? How do you get these private banking interests or these elite banking interests out of there and go back to a Congress that's running America for America and not for the bankers?
Well, that's a fair question. And, there's an old saying, an honest politician is one who stays bought. But I don't think that really goes to the heart of the matter. It is true that Congress was drenched with Wall Street money and still is drenched with Wall Street money year after year. But I don't think that's the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that many people adopted this political philosophy that Wall Street could do no wrong and that the best government was no government and that even the capital markets did not require any sort of reserves, any sort of capital requirements, any sort of regulation. And that's just not true. I mean, ever since we had banks, going back to the experiences in Italy in the Middle Ages, we've known that without a capital requirement, banks blow up. It's that simple. It happens over and over and over again. And the fact that through government insurance and through various public relations efforts, we've been able to avoid runs on the banks in most cases, although Britain had one just last year. Although we've gotten good at avoiding runs on the banks, the fact remains that even when the banks deal with each other, banks can lose confidence in each other. That's why the markets froze up or seized up the way they did last September. It's because nobody knew whether anybody else, even among the banks, was creditworthy. So the bottom line is that we need regulation in order to have a functioning banking system. And without regulation, there's no confidence in your counterparties. Counterparty risk skyrockets, and you run into frequent, not just occasional, but frequent blowups. You run into situations where you have this very stark choice to allow a huge institution to fail and set off repercussions through the whole economy, or to bail that institution out with taxpayer funds, which in many respects is even worse. That shouldn't be the choice. It wasn't the choice for decades and even centuries in this country, and it doesn't have to be the choice now. So we need to make sure that if an institution is too big to fail, it's too big to exist, and we act accordingly.
Congressman Grayson, were you there for the Harry Markopolos testimony?
Yeah, I've known Harry for years.
Okay, yeah, Harry's a great guy. And he talked about the corruption at the SEC, and he spoke to me when I interviewed him about the corruption at the Federal Reserve. It was basically that the SEC was kind of set up and run for the banks and by the banks. I mean, was there truth to that? Now that you've had a chance to hear his testimony, and you know Harry, I know Harry, was that a fair thing to say at the time?
The SEC has been and still is deeply, deeply ineffective. Part of the SEC's license as an institution is to bar people from the securities business when they've proven that all they do is cause trouble. They have the license, they have the authority to debar people from working in the securities industry. And they've done this occasionally with people like Michael Milken. It doesn't happen very often historically, but what you see is that with regard to all the troubles that we've had in our economy for the past year, including outrageous misconduct by people at AIG, where there was no way they could have made good on the bets that they were placing without a federal bailout. None of those people have been punished. And I think people are deeply disturbed by that. You know, the fundamental essence of capitalism, which I agree with, is that you reward people who succeed and you punish people who fail. And people see these bailouts as limiting responsibility for gross, huge failures. But the SEC is responsible, too, because it's the SEC's job to make sure these failures don't happen again, by actually saying you can no longer work in stocks and bonds, you can no longer work in stocks and bonds. And that simply hasn't happened. Nobody has been held responsible. Nobody's been held accountable. The same people who blew up one institution are now working at another institution and likely to blow that one up as well. If we don't learn from mistakes, we're going to keep making them, and the problem's just going to get worse.
With regards to that, I saw you, this was a different congressional testimony, and this goes back a month or two. I apologize for not remembering when, but you were asking, had they barred anybody? And I think they said to you at that time, or the representative did, that to their knowledge they hadn't. And like you said, I haven't heard of anything happening. So what about this? How do we reform the SEC so that it does its job, so that it does what it's supposed to do, which is safeguard the American people from this type of blatant corruption?
Well, one thing we need to do is really change the people in charge. There needs to be a wholesale extermination of the top reaches of that organization, just like most of the federal bureaucracy, because the SEC for years, under the previous administration, was run by people who did not believe there should be an SEC. The classic example of this is that there was a hotline that the SEC established, not to report securities fraud, but to report your sense that the SEC regulators were being unfair to you. So there was a hotline for evildoers to report to complain about the fact that they were being punished for their misconduct. There was a hotline for that. And that shows you how crazy things have gotten, because the people in charge fundamentally did not believe in securities regulation. They fundamentally did not believe in any form of regulation. And they were quite willing to let the free market do whatever the free market felt like doing, even if that meant ripping everybody off and leading us to the brink of national bankruptcy.
Did you think it was absurd recently when the Federal Reserve hired a PR firm?
Well, for sure. And look who they hired. They hired the PR person who was in charge of Enron's PR. I guess because if you're going to be doing Enron accounting like the Federal Reserve has been doing, you want Enron's PR person to explain it. The Federal Reserve does not need a PR person. The Federal Reserve needs to be responsible to the people, and that would be a welcome change.
The forefathers of the country warned us, not to let European interests come in and control or be part of decisions, I guess I should say, in the United States. When we look at the Federal Reserve, what is the Federal Reserve? I mean, it's not federal, right? It's this privately owned banking institution. And where do the tentacles go? Are they Americans? Are they Europeans? Who are they?
Well, we got a clue about that when the Federal Reserve, in a time of great national stress in our credit markets, decided to fork over $500 billion to foreigners, and most of that money went to Europe.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Congressman Grayson. Greatly appreciated.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting people know what's really going on. It's amazing to people when they hear about this, but they don't read about it in their newspapers. They don't read it. They don't see it on their TV screen. What they do is they have to turn to people like you to find out what's really going on. And in a way, that's the most amazing thing of all. $500 billion handed over to foreigners. You don't hear about it anywhere but here.
Thank you for joining us at KingWorldNews.com. Remember to go to our homepage for more interviews. Be sure to tune in next week for another great show where we will have John Malden, Michael O'Higgins, and much more.